Still, when the entire precinct break room had already gone quiet, with the particular stillness that follows an unexpected discovery, a boy sitting in the corner of a detective's office, waiting for his caseworker to arrive, looked up sharply at the sound coming from the detective's phone and said, with a certainty that made the detective's pen slip from his fingers entirely, "That's my dad's voice on your phone." Nobody in that office yet understood why a routine evidence recording, played back as part of an entirely unrelated case, would suddenly connect to a 10-year-old boy who had spent the past 3 years believing his father had simply vanished without explanation. The boy's name was Tobias. He was 10 years old, and he had spent the past 3 years moving through the foster care system. Ever since his father, a man named Julius Reyes, had disappeared under circumstances that had never been fully explained to him. Tobias had been 7 at the time, and the adults around him had offered only fragments that his father had gotten into some kind of trouble, that the situation was complicated, that it was better, for now, for Tobias to focus on settling into his new living arrangements rather than dwelling on questions nobody seemed willing or able to answer fully. Before we go any further, if you believe that the truth has a way of surfacing exactly when it is needed most, and that a child's certainty should never be dismissed without first being carefully examined, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to believe that even the most confusing losses can eventually find their way toward explanation. The detective's name was Marcus Delacroix, a veteran investigator with the city's cold case division, who had been working for the better part of 8 months on an entirely unrelated matter involving a series of unsolved disappearances connected to a criminal network the department had been slowly dismantling over several years. That afternoon, Tobias had been brought to the precinct not because of any connection to Delacroix's case, but simply because his current foster placement had fallen through unexpectedly, and the caseworker managing his file had asked Delacroix, an old family friend from outside her professional circle, if Tobias could wait quietly in his office for an hour while she sorted out emergency placement arrangements. Delacroix, reviewing evidence recordings related to his ongoing investigation while keeping half an eye on the quiet, watchful boy sitting in the corner of his office, had been listening to a recovered voicemail recording, one of several pieces of audio evidence connected to a suspect the department had been building a case against for months. A recording of a man's voice leaving a brief, seemingly innocuous message about a delayed delivery schedule. The kind of mundane audio fragment that investigators sometimes had to review dozens of times before understanding its full significance within a larger case. What Delacroix did not yet know, because there was no reasonable way for him to know it in that moment, was that the voice on that recording belonged to Julius Reyes, Tobias's father, a man who had not simply vanished 3 years earlier, as Tobias had been told, but who had in fact entered a witness protection arrangement after cooperating with federal investigators regarding the very criminal network Delacroix's cold case division had spent years trying to dismantle. Before we continue, we want to pause here, because what Tobias experienced hearing that recording involved a recognition so immediate and so certain that it left no room for the kind of doubt an adult, more accustomed to questioning their own memory, might have felt in the same circumstance. Children, psychologists have long understood, often retain acoustic memories of a parent's voice, with a clarity that persists even through years of separation, an auditory imprint formed during the earliest, most formative years of attachment. Tobias had spent 3 years without hearing his father's voice, but the specific cadence, the particular way certain words were pronounced, the small verbal habits, unique to Julius, that no amount of time apart had erased from his memory, all of it struck him with an immediate, undeniable certainty the moment the recording played. Delacroix, startled by the boy's sudden, urgent declaration, initially responded with the practiced, gentle skepticism he had developed over years of working with traumatized children in various investigative contexts, understanding that grief and confusion could sometimes produce false certainties in a child desperate for answers about a missing parent. He asked Tobias, carefully and without dismissiveness, what made him so certain. And Tobias, undeterred by the detective's cautious tone, described specific details about his father's voice, a particular way he pronounced certain words, a habit of clearing his throat before beginning to speak, details specific enough that Delacroix, despite his professional caution, found himself genuinely unsettled. What followed was a conversation that would ultimately unravel 3 years of confusion for Tobias, though it unfolded with the careful, methodical pace that any responsible investigation required, rather than any immediate dramatic revelation. Delacroix, recognizing that he could not simply dismiss the boy's certainty, given the specific, consistent details he described, contacted his supervisor and eventually the federal agency overseeing the witness protection arrangement connected to the recording, initiating a careful, sensitive process of verification that took several weeks to properly navigate, given the significant legal and security protocols involved in any witness protection situation. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge the complicated circumstances that had led to Tobias's 3 years of confusion and loss in the first place. Circumstances that involve genuine danger rather than any failure of love on his father's part. Julius Reyes had, 3 years earlier, witnessed a serious crime connected to the same criminal network Delacroix's division had spent years investigating, and had made the difficult decision to cooperate with federal investigators despite the considerable personal risk involved. A decision that had required him, under strict federal protocol, to disappear entirely from his previous life, including, devastatingly, from his young son, in order to protect both himself and Tobias from the very real danger the criminal network posed to anyone connected to a witness who testified against them. The federal agency overseeing Julius's protection arrangement had, in the immediate aftermath of his relocation, worked with local child services to ensure Tobias's placement in a safe, stable foster environment. But the specific, sensitive nature of witness protection protocols had prevented any direct explanation to Tobias about the true circumstances of his father's disappearance, a painful but legally necessary silence that had left a 10-year-old boy believing, for 3 devastating years, that his father had simply abandoned him without explanation or care. Once the verification process confirmed what Tobias had recognized immediately through nothing more than the sound of a familiar voice, federal officials, working carefully with the local child services agency and Delacroix himself, began the delicate process of determining whether and how a supervised reunion between Tobias and his father might be safely arranged. Given that the underlying security concerns that had necessitated Julius's protection arrangement in the first place had, by that point, been substantially resolved following successful prosecutions within the criminal network he had originally testified against. Julius Reyes, once contacted through the appropriate federal channels and informed that his son had recognized his voice on an unrelated evidence recording, found himself overwhelmed by an emotion he had spent 3 years trying to carefully manage. Having lived every day of his protection arrangement carrying the specific, devastating grief of a father forbidden from any contact with the son he loved. A grief made only more complicated by knowing that Tobias likely believed, throughout that entire painful silence, that his father had simply chosen to leave him behind. The reunion, once federal officials confirmed it could proceed safely, was arranged carefully, with appropriate psychological support available for both father and son, given the complicated, painful nature of the separation they had both endured. Delacroix, who had become an unlikely but genuinely invested figure in ensuring the reunion happened properly, was present, along with Tobias's caseworker, When Julius Reyes finally saw his son again after 3 years of enforced, heartbreaking separation. What followed was, by every account of those present, one of the most emotionally overwhelming moments any of the assembled adults had witnessed in their respective careers. Tobias running immediately into his father's arms. The moment recognition became fully mutual. Both of them, according to Delacroix's own later description of the scene, crying in a way that seemed to release 3 years of accumulated grief and confusion in a single, overwhelming embrace. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge the people whose careful, patient work made this reunion possible. Work that unfolded far from any dramatic courtroom moment, but that mattered every bit as much. The federal agents who had managed Julius's protection arrangement with genuine care, despite the painful separation their protocols required, understanding fully the weight of what they were asking a father to sacrifice. Tobias's various foster caregivers over the preceding 3 years, who had provided stability and care during a period of profound uncertainty, even without knowing the full truth of his father's absence. Delacroix himself, who had chosen curiosity and careful investigation over easy dismissal when a grieving child made an unusual, unexpected claim in his office that afternoon. In the months following their reunion, Julius Reyes worked closely with federal officials and child services to establish a permanent, stable custody arrangement. His continued safety from the previously dismantled criminal network, no longer requiring the strict protective isolation that had once separated him from his son. Tobias, after 3 years of moving through an often unstable foster system, finally returned to living permanently with his father, a transition that, while joyful, also required both of them to navigate the considerable emotional complexity of rebuilding a relationship interrupted so abruptly and painfully during some of Tobias's most formative years. A child psychologist named Dr. Fenimore, brought in specifically to support the family's reunification process, worked with both Julius and Tobias over the following year, helping them navigate not just the joy of their reunion, but the genuine grief and confusion Tobias had carried for 3 years. Feelings that did not simply disappear the moment father and son were reunited, but that required careful, ongoing attention to properly process and heal. Delacroix, whose own career had been built largely around solving cases involving considerably more distant, impersonal circumstances, found himself deeply affected by his unexpected involvement in Tobias and Julius's story, later telling colleagues that the case had reminded him, after many years in investigative work, exactly why the careful, patient pursuit of truth mattered so profoundly, not simply for abstract justice, but for the very real, human reunions that truth sometimes made possible. 2 years passed. Tobias, now 12, had settled into a stable, secure life with his father, the two of them slowly rebuilding the close bond that had once defined their relationship before circumstances beyond either of their control had torn them apart. Julius, who had struggled considerably in the aftermath of his testimony to rebuild any semblance of normal life, found genuine stability finally taking hold once the arrangement's most restrictive protocols were lifted, following the successful, permanent resolution of the underlying criminal case. Delacroix remained close with the family throughout this period, visiting periodically and maintaining what had become, somewhat unexpectedly given the case's unusual origins, a genuine friendship with both father and son. He often told Tobias during these visits that he considered the afternoon of their unexpected discovery one of the most meaningful moments of his entire career, not because of any dramatic investigative breakthrough, but because of what it had ultimately restored to a family that had lost so much through circumstances entirely outside their control. On the 3rd anniversary of their reunion, Julius and Tobias held a small gathering, Delacroix and Tobias's former caseworker among the guests, along with Dr. Fenimore, who had supported their difficult reunification process throughout that first crucial year. Tobias, asked to say a few words, spoke simply about the specific sound of his father's voice, about how certain he had felt the moment he heard it, and about how grateful he remained that a detective in an unrelated case had chosen to take his certainty seriously rather than dismissing it as simply the confused hope of a grieving child. Never underestimate the specific lasting power of a child's memory for the people they love most. Never assume that grief and confusion automatically undermine a child's certainty about something they know to be true. Never dismiss an unusual claim without first considering whether careful investigation might reveal something genuinely important beneath it. And never forget that sometimes the truth, however long delayed by circumstances beyond anyone's control, still finds its way back to the people who need it most. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment about the part that stayed with you longest, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the truth, however painfully delayed, still matters. Subscribe for more stories about family, justice, and the quiet ways separated loved ones sometimes find their way back to each other. Because sometimes, the most important breakthrough in an investigation comes not from painstaking forensic analysis, but from the simple, unshakable certainty of a child who recognizes, without any doubt at all, the voice of the person they love most.